Good evening, everyone. This is Indrajit Gupta from Founding Fuel. I'm a co-founder at Founding Fuel. We've been running these masterclasses at Founding Fuel for the last several months, and I can't think of a more critical theme for the sessions that we've had than the one that we're about to start, which is navigating the Great Indian Slowdown. It's something that I think has been agitating the minds of entrepreneurs, corporate chieftains, the country as a whole, because everyone's trying to figure out and try and make sense of how that's kind of playing out and how should we respond. And I think we've got the pleasure of, I think, a panel that you couldn't have asked for a better, more stellar panel today. And I'm not going to kind of spend a lot of time introducing them because they're clearly names that you'll all be familiar with, and we've, I think, provided their backgrounds to you. But it's truly a local panel in that sense. We've got people joining from all across the country and from Boston. I'll start with Mr. Arun Maira, who's joining us from Gurgaon. Mr. Maira, good evening.
Good evening.
I'll move to Rama, who's joining us from Bombay.
Hi, good evening.
Again, both names you'd be familiar with. And I've got Anurag Bihar coming in from Bangalore. Anurag, hi.
Hi, good evening.
Hi. And Sumit joins us from Calcutta, Sumit Chaudhary. And finally, we've got Tarun Khanna joining us from Boston. Good morning, Tarun.
Good morning, good evening.
I hand it over to Mr. Maira, who very kindly agreed to anchor this session. All of us, the rest of us, except the panel, will be on mute and on audio. Mr. Maira will set the context in a bit. But before that, just keep remembering that while the session is on, you have the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and you can key in your questions as we go along. And at some point in the conversation, we will turn the focus onto the questions that you've shared and try and kind of see what the panel has to say. So that's broadly the tenor. We've got about 90 minutes in all. We've got enough time to, I think, really look at this from different perspectives and try and kind of make some sense of where we're headed and what we should do, both as a country and as businesses as well. So without much ado, I'm going to kind of hand over the reins to Mr. Maira. Mr. Maira.
Thank you very much, Indrajit. And I'm so pleased to be with Tarun, Rama, Sumit, and Anurag, and yourself here in this discussion, and with the many, many people who I believe are listening in to us. And I hope we'll do well and provide all of you are listening with something to chew on as we discuss together here. Navigating the Great Indian Slowdown or downturn, as Indrajit has put it, is the subject that's on our minds here this evening, and it is the subject on many people's minds. For the last few months, anytime I went out and met anybody, they'd say, "So, Mr. Maira, what do you think is going on?" So I'd say the weather is good, and I wonder when it's going to turn sunny or cold. They say, no, get to the real things. What's going on with the economy? It's been on people's minds for quite a while in India. What is going on really? Earlier it was a wonder whether things are slowing down or not. But in the last few months, it's very clearly the feeling that things have slowed down. And now the concern about why have they slowed down and what is required to turn them around, turn things around, the economy around. So this is the big question that we have. When I was asked to work with Indrajit to design our discussion this evening, I thought of the Titanic. I thought of sort of people on the Titanic, many of them who are wanting to make themselves more comfortable as the ship is going, and they may be sensing some, troubles, the ship bouncing up and down a little bit. But just making themselves more comfortable, changing the cushions on the chairs and rearranging the chairs on the deck while the ship carries on. And some people began to notice that the ship was heading in the wrong direction. And then they were trying to look through the fog and say, well, what's happening out there? Is it a danger? Should we be changing the ship's direction? And then getting everyone's attention to change the ship's direction was what took too long. And of course, we know the rest of the story of the Titanic. So I thought that we should think of the big things that are affecting the economy. But before we get there, we should look for evidence of what we see, all of us see on the ground, as it were. Each of us, Rama, Anurag, Tarun, you in Boston, and you do spend a lot of time in India, of course, and Sumit, we are seeing India through our own lenses and different aspects of India in our work. So what are we noticing on the decks, as it were? What's happening? How are people sensing the turbulence? How are they responding? Do we see green shoots? The concern is for many of us, for myself, and when people ask me what's going on in the economy, I said, look, I don't know. The data that one should have to determine whether things are all right is not there anymore. The people in the cockpit are telling us that, look, the navigation instruments have failed. At the same time, they're telling us, don't worry, we are going to get you to the destination on time in spite of the storm outside. It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in the navigation of the plane. In this case, I've changed the metaphor a bit. So we must look for more immediate indicators of how things are happening, because the big signs are not available to us, it seems. And so the proximate causes. I was reading in the Mint the other day several indicators, high frequency indicators, for example, that passenger traffic on the Indian railways, which is actually a good indicator of the state of the economy for the masses, was 902 million in the Q3 of this year, which was lower than the Q2 of the 2013 year, when it was over 1 billion. So passenger traffic on railways has been declining for the last few years. I mean, some people say to me, who travel more by air, like I do, meet at airports, and they say, who's saying the economy is doing badly? Just look at these airports, they're so crowded. They're so crowded. Well, yes, maybe a few people are still flying around, but it seems that for the masses, according to this indicator of railways, the economy has slowed down. Then we hear that sales of two-wheelers, which are usually an indicator of the fortunes of our middle class in India, have contracted by as much as 20% in the second quarter of this year. And then the contraction in the third quarter was 15%. And of course, people took some comfort in that, oh, it's less of a contraction than we had in the previous quarter, but it's hardly a sign of a robust economy. And the bigger indicators like investment to the GDP this year in India is expected to be 28.1%, whereas it was 35.8% in financial year 28. So it's fallen very substantially in the last 10 years. The number of new investment projects announced during the last quarter fell by 44% to only 473, which is the lowest number of new projects in any quarter since 2005. And so these are worrying signs, both the big ones perhaps, and certainly the small ones that I have mentioned. I'm going to ask, starting with perhaps you, Rama, what are you seeing happening in the Indian economy affecting the lives of people?
You know, I'm definitely seeing companies not in a mood to invest. I spend a lot of time in both worlds. As far as people are concerned, I'm seeing the good news as well as the bad news. I think, let me preface it by saying that I think we look at fairly simple indicators fairly simply. For example, if you take two-wheelers, and I'll come to people in a minute, you know, two-wheelers and cars, I think a lot of the demand that we've seen is what I have characterized publicly as Ponzi demand in some ways, because I think it was a stuffing of the pipeline. The dealers were fueled by one set of NBFCs, the customers were fueled by another set of NBFCs. You know, where the sales were being booked and when was a big issue. So you're right, the numbers are very complicated to look at, because last quarter versus this quarter, or last year same quarter versus this year same quarter, we're seeing a little bit of corporate gains on the one hand, which are not necessarily a reflection of true demand. If you look at, for example, airlines versus rail, if you just look at the expanded footprint that we're actually seeing for airlines, and a chowkidar in a building will say that आप मेरा वाराणसी का टिकट करा दीजिएगा क्योंकि he will save time and he will save money as a result of being able to work longer, and he can actually do that in 3 or 4,000 rupees. How long this picnic is going to last is a completely different question. I'm also seeing some companies doing systematically well. At the height of the, oh my God, consumption is dying, companies like Asian Paints did very well. Nestle continues to do well. We don't do as well as we would like to do, but the question is that where has that benchmark of what we would like to do actually come from? So are things trending downwards? They are trending downwards, but companies who are on strategy are doing better than companies who are off strategy and being opportunistic. So I think we're seeing a separation of the winners and the losers, and we're used to looking at average data. As far as consumers are concerned, it is true that the big problem is investment. I think India Inc. has been on an investment strike for a long time, with good reason, without good reason. We can and will examine. But when companies don't invest and your entire population is more or less self-employed, except for a lucky quarter of the upper class, clearly when real estate, the lordships have tanked real estate and told them to go straight, and to please straighten out their business model, which doesn't work when you go straight. They're not announcing new projects. A lot of rural India actually depends on construction, agriculture, and mining. We know what's been happening on all three of them. So I think we are net. Of course, things are not as good as we would like them to be at all. I think some are doing better than the others. We should be careful not to look at averages in any kind of way. I think that the biggest source of collapse that we're actually seeing is policy flip-flop and fickleness. And that's where the problem's starting from. The rich India continues to do well enough. Poor India is actually getting into a fairly bad shape.
Thanks, Rama. Thank you. Rich India doing well enough, poor India getting into bad shape. Anurag, you travel into the depths of India quite a lot in your work. What are you seeing?
Well, yeah, you're right. So let's say, just to give you a sense, over the past year, I would have traveled to 65 or 70 odd districts. And these are all the more disadvantaged districts, the poorer districts of the country, right? And what I see there is what I would characterize as a steady decline. I haven't seen anything sharp in the last year or the last year and a half. But it's been this steady decline, steady sense of economic struggle that is there on the ground. And I'm, like Rama referred to, I'm talking about perhaps the poorest or the poorer people of the country. And that's sort of, let's say, that's the background. And in that background, perhaps three specific things. One, is this that over the past 12, 18 months, and this is what I have seen, I've seen, I think, a steady fall in migration to what perhaps would have been earlier some kind of employment generation magnets, which are the bigger cities, right? How severe is it? What percentage has it fallen by? I don't know that, but I can see that, right? So that's one. Two, is this that the sense of crisis, the sense of helplessness in the agrarian economy has only increased, which is what I encounter mostly, right? It's only increased. Three, that in the small towns or the mid-category towns that I visit very often, if I ask the simple question, "Acha, naukri ki kya hal chal hai?" Right? I think things have only worsened over the past, and this is not again 18 months. I would say past 10 years, it's just a steady decline on this particular matter. So, and I really wonder whether we are really bothered or focused about the fundamental and structural issues which are impacting the really disadvantaged, 85% of this country. The way the economic downturn is talked about, it does continue to remain focused on the matters of the middle class and upper middle class. I think that if you were to look at the disadvantaged people of this country, they are in the grip of a much bigger economic problem.
Right. Wow. So it's something longer term. It's not something that has been caused by demonetization or GST recently. Something that has been going on for 10 or 15 years, but we haven't been paying attention to it. We've been sort of celebrating what's been happening above that, sales of two-wheelers and more people flying, for example. And it's something I think we must explore about the shape of our whole system, of our economy in India. Tarun, you are in one way far away, but you have been coming to India so frequently and helping with enterprises in this country, small enterprises who are doing fairly well, I gather, even though they are operating in this environment, which, as we've been hearing, is not such a happy one. What are your perceptions?
Thanks, Arun, and thanks to the others, Anurag and Rama. I mean, I'm very aware of this. I think Rama characterized it well, which is rich India doing well, poor India less so, something along those lines.
We lost your voice a bit. Huh?
Hi, can you hear me?
Stay a little closer, yes, and thank you.
Okay, let me lean forward. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah.
I was saying that, the characterization that Rama offered and Anurag accentuated, right, which is rich India doing well and poor India less so, I mean, rings true to me based on what I hear. But I'm not sure that's where my value added is. Let me comment a little bit on one paradox that I see, a bit of a paradox, and I can think of resolutions to the paradox, but it's nonetheless a paradox. And secondly, make some observations more about the part of India that is globally connected, which need not be necessarily rich India, but it's correlated with the rich India. So first on the paradox, I mean, some of you would know I spend a lot of time in China on a continuing basis the last 25 years. And in a sense, I think of, the infrastructure, the tech infrastructure that's rolling out, courtesy the mobile phone and courtesy other attempts made by both the state and by different private sector entities, lagging China by 7, 8, 9, 10 years, something like this. But at the end of the day, even our poorer populations seem much more connected to the rest of the world. So given that, if you think about that, that's the paradox to me, is that the infrastructure that normally was missing, and you had these sort of islands of penury, completely disconnected from centers of economic growth and centers of learning and so on. That disconnectedness has at least technologically reduced. The supply side is a lot better. And yet we have the gloom and doom that Anurag was characterizing amongst the poorest, and rising agrarian helplessness, less migration to centers of learning and opportunity, and so on. So it really is doubly saddening in some ways, I think, is the way I would say it. It also occurs to me that it would be nice to, Arun, in your opening comments, you said what to me would be the most sobering of the comments that have been said so far, which is that we don't have the data to make sense of any of this, that you can't find the data to make sense of this. Whether that's due to mismanagement or active distortion or what have you, I can't say. But that's very concerning. And it seems to me that we, particularly apropos the rural slowdown, we ought to be able to put together data, both from public sources as well as a lot of companies that operate in the innermost parts of India to make sense of it. So that's the first thing. It's a bit of a paradox to me that the infrastructure is so good, but the penury and the dismay is more widespread. On the more globally connected piece, I see unbridled optimism. Actually, I don't see any diminution of that in the last 12 to 18 months. If anything, in pockets of the economy, I see it rising. It doesn't seem to. I don't know that the state of the economy is particularly correlated with short-run investment flows in effectively in risk capital, in enterprise creation, things of that nature. And maybe, as Rama was saying, that there is in effect a winnowing going out, which is the companies that have their acts together, the entrepreneurs who have their acts together, the private equity providers who have their acts together, can figure out how to navigate even this great Indian slowdown. So I leave it at that, Arun. I mean, I don't see any doom or gloom in that segment. I think I'm inferring the expectation must be that in their time horizons, 5, 7, 8 years, when they may want to realize the return on whatever capital, organizational, human, financial capital they're putting into their enterprises and efforts, they must think that this is a cyclical rather than a secular slowdown. Now, if they're wrong about that, then eventually the gloom will spread to them also. But so far, I don't see it. Let me stop with that.
Right. Well, thanks, Tarun. As you said, you come in with a special perspective amongst all of us because you're able to step back and look at the bigger picture and indeed compare India with China and other countries too. But the point that you made about indicators and not having the right information, what are good indicators that would tell us whether the people on the ground in the remotest districts of India are doing well? Well, very clearly the stock market and how it is doing, which is a very regularly reported, perhaps accurately reported high frequency indicator, doesn't tell us anything about what's happening on the ground. And similarly, I think GDP, which we pay so much attention to measuring, has been hiding from our view what's actually happening inside the economy. We get the gross figure and worry about its percentage points is up and down. So there is a question about what we should be looking for and where we should be looking and how we should be looking for what we should be looking for. But I'm going to keep that and come back to it perhaps again. But Sumit, to bring you in, you work a lot recently in cities, and cities combine the best and the worst. As you say, the modern world, which Tarun is talking about, which is connected internationally and flies away and lives like as they would anywhere in the world, here in our cities. At the same time, those poorest of poor people live not very well or hardly well inside the very same cities. What are you observing about India as you look through the lens of cities?
Thank you, Arun. I think I'm going to look at this whole thing in two lenses. So one, definitely from the point of view of how the government has been trying to manage the cities, but also from the point of view of a startup or a small medium enterprise trying to navigate through this slowdown. And let me take the second one first, and then I'll bring in the context of the city into it. Over the last few years, we have seen the government come up with a lot of policies to help and attract new startups to start. They have come up with a lot of slogans and headline level policies. These are statements which are the fifth statement in the way the government actually executes these policies. So if you take a look at what they have said, and I'll take a couple of these policies which have been either contrarian to existing policies or actually were absolutely ineffective when you really put it into practice. They gave tax breaks to companies over a 7-year period initially, and they put an arbitrary date of 2016, and they also came up with some criteria of defining what a MSME is or a startup is, and only 30 or 40 companies have been able to get these tax breaks in the last 5 years. And Geo is one of them. So you can understand the context of these 30 companies that got tax breaks by calling themselves a startup. There were other policies which were introduced over time in terms of funding and giving debt funding to startups and MSMEs in 60 minutes. There is no data whatsoever as to how many applied, how many got the funding. I went through the process and myself to actually come up with a better critique of the process. And after the 60 minutes were up, at 58 minutes, I was awarded a wholesome amount of 2 lakhs as the funding, which probably my driver would have given me more funding after going through that. And in the process, most of my personal and company data was uploaded into a third-party system, which was not owned by the government. If you take a look at the Startup India and their policies around it, only 2 to 3% of the amount that they had thought actually got dispersed in the first 4 years of the program. It's not that the government has no intentions. Their intentions in this thing were absolutely perfect, except that these got buried into other policies which did not get changed. I think that was the necessary administrative processes that needed to be addressed along with the policy changes. Next, I'm going to come to the government spend. A lot of the economy actually still relies on the massive amount of government spend that happens on projects and infrastructure in railways and airports and all of those things. And putting my startup and MSME hat on, mostly the startups don't qualify for it. So essentially that is not going to aid the startups becoming better, addressing the requirements of the government, or do well by using that money to do anything. Innovation buying has been a challenge for the government as well. They can buy 1 crore of outdoor advertising in a heartbeat because they know how to go about doing it. But buying 1 day of a subject matter expert or buying one small project from an innovative company is almost impossible unless they get consultants. And I think Rama was talking a little bit before our session about why 200 consultants got hired from the IIM campuses. I think part of that is to buy innovation, you will need consultants, and that a lot of the money, the initial part of the startup or the smart cities program, also got consumed by the consultants. Whether they were qualified to do the job was secondary, but the money was available to consultants only, not to the people who have the innovation, not to the people who are going to implement it, or with people with skills. In the government buying schemes, I think the next piece is failure is not accepted. So if any energetic IS officer is going to give a project, innovation project, he's got to think 10 times, because if the startup fails or is not able to qualify through, he's going to get blamed for giving it to them. The tendering process is very, very complicated. I would say we as Gaia have been extremely successful in working through 130 cities, 13 zones of the Indian Railways, airports, all of that. But the tendering process is the Achilles heel for most people to get through. And the way these government spending tenders are designed, it is designed to grow at the Hindu rate of return. Means your next year's project cannot be more than about 20% more than your this year's project. So you cannot take on a very big project. You are never allowed to scale exponentially. So if you do take a project, you will only grow at a particular pace. So that is one of the things. Now, if I look at cities and the problems that are there in the cities, the problem is integrated thinking. The cities, the officials who are there have got no understanding of the real challenges on the ground. Require that these problems require a more systematic way of approaching housing, transportation, sanitation, water supply. All of these are very related problems, and only recently have we seen the officers sit together on a table and discuss this holistically. So far, these were independent projects, and we are seeing this. So from my point of view, that's a very positive thing that is happening, is the collaboration between departments have improved significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. The next thing that has improved on the positive side is the use of data. There was a time when all decisions and everything was being done through gut feel. Everybody seemed to know what they know, though they were only there for 2-3 years in the position, but they were expected to be experts. But right now, everybody is gathering data. They're gathering data on traffic, air pollution, water supply, water levels, depth. So this whole proliferation of data is what is going to help us in the next 5 to 10 years. It's not done us too much good yet, but I think there is a huge opportunity for startups and MSMEs to come in and innovate, provided the government gets the first thing going right.
So thank you, Sumit. I can see green shoots in the way the government is beginning to work now, and that gives us hope that the people in government are beginning to sort of think of the whole system as a system and see, each of themselves as parts only of the solutions to the bigger issues, which, as Anurag had mentioned before, have been bothering us for decades now, actually. And unless we get a more systemic way of working, we are not going to be resolving these deeper issues that are structural issues affecting our economy. So thanks for giving the hope that there is a change, small though it is, that is happening. But that leads me to put this question to all of you now, that it's the way in which we see what's going on, and then the way in which we work together and address what is going on and what we feel needs to happen. That may be the key to make the economy turn around. And in a way in which the people at the bottom of the pyramid experience the growth and begin to contribute by the increase in their own incomes to the growth and to the demands for of investors who need the growth of the market. So the change of thinking, Anurag, I'm going to come to you. Do you see this happening in terms of the way the government systems are working on the ground? I hear, it's anecdotal, in Odisha it seems to be better than other places.
Not really.
No?
I can't see any change, any significant improvement on the ground over the past 5-10 years. It's much the same. And clearly, there are variations across states, but those variations across states have remained pretty stable. So it's not as though state A was different 10 years from B, and now somehow the differences changed. So I don't really see any kind of a difference on the ground. It's pretty much the same kind of setup, the same kind of system, the same kind of attitudes and perspectives, the same kind of the flavor of the week and the flavor of the month. So I don't really see anything. And I think I deal mostly with public systems, right? Mostly education, a little bit of other kinds of systems, but I don't really see any kind of a change. I think, let me just point out one more thing. That doesn't mean that there are no good people, there's no good stuff happening. That doesn't mean that at all. But is there any reason to believe, from what I have seen, that there's any trajectory of change towards the positive on all these matters? And again, it's not just 5 years, it's over the past 10 years. And I would say no, really, none.
That's very despairing. Yes. Tarun, you have been working with Niti Aayog, and I have been, sensing that what Sumit was saying, I can see green shoots of that in the way Niti Aayog is engaging with, like for example, the aspirational districts, and Anurag, I mean, you might have many things to say about that too, about, making many things happen together in a district. So that the overall condition of people in those poorest districts improves. What have you noticed, Tarun, in terms of the way our government works in the Niti Aayog, and any experience you have with China?
Thanks, Arun. I have a couple of comments to pick up again on our colleagues' different statements, Sumit's and Anurag's. The first is that I definitely think that the intent of significant parts of the government is there to do things better, right? Obviously, this is a small sample empiricism. It's based on maybe 2-3 dozen government bureaucrats and functionaries and ministers that I interact with on a regular basis last few years. But there is more of a, how can we do better kind of attitude. Now, I fully agree that that's not translated down through the rank and file of the bureaucracy, and things get buried. So Sumit was giving the example of Startup India, which is apparently, based on his comments, bedeviled by disbursement problems. And that's a very common problem, is that something gets sanctioned, somebody's approved for something, and the money doesn't show up for weeks and months on end. So the whole point of it is lost. Somehow we don't seem to have the administrative will to tackle that. So that's one observation. The second is that there is a big failing in India, sort of at a very conceptual, abstract level that I think permeates all our efforts. And whenever I can, I shine a light on it. One of the things that you've noticed, anybody who has spent time in China the last 20, 30 years, in any big country, you know, with a distribution of abilities and intents in the population, as they would be in both China and India, you should expect to see considerable numbers of well-intentioned and, in fact, well-orchestrated local efforts at doing something better, right? Rural, urban, whatever, traditional economy, new age economy, etc. And you see that both in China and in India. The difference is that in China, they're able to identify these experiments that are running wherever they occur and provide the mandate and the infrastructure to scale it across the country. Right? And that's been true since 1982, 83. Those are the first experiments that I can think of. If I recall correctly, there was a small city in China that had some novel way, not quite fitting into the regular rule structure, of playing with local finances to induce at the margin a better, more economic activity. And when that was seen to work, it was very quick for the provincial government and then the Communist Party in China to take that experiment and roll it across the country over the next 5 to 7 years. We don't see that. Right? We don't see much learning and cross-fertilization of ideas in India. And I think it goes back to the sclerotic structure of whatever we've inherited and whatever we failed to tackle. So that's I think the Achilles heel, that even though you see many well-intentioned and very interesting efforts all over the country, it's difficult to move from there. I mean, just taking a personal example, I've been a co-founder of several science-based enterprises in Bangalore. And increasingly, I've come to the despairing realization that the only way to grow them beyond a certain point is to move them out of India, because it just gets completely hampered and tied up in the mess that we're unable to fix. So in the short run, for the survival of the enterprise, you've got to move it out. And that's a very sad commentary. The last thing I would say, I don't know which of my colleagues mentioned it before, is that we have, as a state, as a society, we have completely failed to use the government as a strategic lever to promote innovation across the board, right? So if you look at, 90% of what ultimately goes into what we see as innovative startups in America comes from public funding. It comes from massive NSF grants to the National Institute of Health, Center for Disease Control. There's an endless number of Department of Defense. And those monies are translated to creating public goods in the form of knowledge. And then individual people that's a societal compact. Individual would-be entrepreneurs take those ideas and build their own things. We don't have the government as an entity. I mean, one of the colleagues was commenting on inability to have modern procurement. And I couldn't agree more. That is such a low-hanging fruit and a lever through which society can be moved, because the government is such a massive buying agent, but we don't seem to be able to address those. So it seems to me that whether you take the example of the US or Israel or China, there's some pretty concrete things that if somehow we could create the wherewithal to focus on those and improve them 10 or 20%, I think that's a pretty dramatic and almost immediate translation to real effects on the ground.
Thank you. I've picked up some very big, broad ideas, and I'm going to just say one or two of them. And then Indrajit, I'd like to hear what others listening in wish to ask us. One very big idea is what Tarun has just mentioned, that India seems to be a slower learning system than is China. In fact, when I was in the planning commission and we were getting advice from economists and people from all over, especially from the West, to tell us how to improve our economy, I put it differently. I'm not an economist. And I said, if a big system begins to do something much better than it was doing before, it has learned to do it. It has learned how to transform itself and acquire capabilities to perform at this higher level. And so if a country has improved its outputs, its performance, its GDP, its infrastructure, and so on, more than another country has over the same period of time, my hypothesis is that the first country has got a better learning system than the other one. Now, they were quite intrigued because introducing the concept of learning into management of economies and inputs and outputs was sort of new to them. But they said, that's good, it's interesting. So they took China, Tarun, the one that you mentioned as a country in India, naturally. I mean, two large Asian countries, similar sizes, starting off their growth journeys in the 1980s, around the same time approximately. And then China's 5 times our size in GDP and many times better than us in terms of depth of its industries and so on. So then I said to them, okay, rather than telling us about the economic policies, why don't you find out how the system in China works, how policy decisions are taken, etc., and compare that with India. And they wrote a terrific paper for us, which pointed us to not looking for advice from economists on how to revive the Indian economy, but how to change the structures of our institutions, especially the learning and implementation institutions on the ground and those above them that enable the learning implementation institutions on the ground to be able to learn from each other. And thus came the concept of the Niti Aayog actually in its charter. So that's the principal thought that I just take, and I wish to keep it and come back to it with all of you a little later. But meanwhile, Indrajit.
So there's been a conversation going on in our learning community on Slack for the past few days. So what I'm going to do, and some fairly interesting ideas came up for conversation and discussion. I'm going to pick some of those and some of the questions that have appeared on the chat box and try and combine them in the limited time that we have. And the first one that I'd like to focus on is on a question around healthcare and education. I mean, most people, I think, would assume that healthcare and education are not immune to, are relatively immune to a slowdown. But I think the question that we kind of been posed by KL Mukesh and Bharat Gera. So they say that, look, do you know how difficult it is to kind of set up private schools in this country? If you're an entrepreneur in the education space and you want to stick to the rules and play by the rules, it is very, very hard. And if you look at healthcare, Bharat says that, you know, healthcare obviously needs to, I think, protect the interests of low-income folks. And Ayushman Bharat was something that the government unveiled fairly recently. But the issue is, are we sure that this is something which can be sustained? Who's going to pay the bills at the end of it? Because hospitals don't make money if they do surgeries under the Ayushman Bharat scheme. So we're left with a situation where healthcare and education, both of which could be big growth drivers in a country like India, aren't firing. So would the panel, for instance, maybe Anurag, who's had some experience, certainly lots of experience with education, you know, Mr. Marab?
Yes, I would, and I'm going to pass it on to Anurag with just adding something to what you said. As you said that the person who asked the question about education said how difficult it is to start a private school. And I'm going to relate it to what Tarun also said about, you know, the public sector, the government plays a great role in innovation and continues to in the United States. Somehow in our country, we've got a bias against government. We think the solutions are going to be to get the government out of the way and to leave it to the private sector, education, maybe healthcare. So there's a big structural issue here and an ideological issue here also that may be in the background here. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Anurag.
Yes, Arun, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, which is that I know starting private schools, getting the licenses to private schools is pretty tough. There's no question about that. But I think the real issue with education and health, and that is, I think, a part of the long-term deep structural issues that I was sort of alluding to earlier, is that education and health are things on which we should have good public systems. And that is at the core of the problem, or it's one of the core problems that we have today. We have a completely broken healthcare system on the public side, absolutely. And you know, not much to talk about the public education system as well. So in the way you characterize that education and health can be growth drivers, yes, they can be, but they're not growth drivers for private investment, private profits, and so on. They are the fundamental growth drivers for human capital and well-being in this country. and which we have dramatically underinvested into. We've mismanaged. And now for decades, perhaps we have known what to do, but we have not done it. So yes, I agree with that, but with this strong caveat that these are such fundamental things that they are at the very basis of the kind of long-term structural decline that I was talking about. And to address them, we have to invest into these public systems. We have to improve these public systems. There's no way out of it.
Yeah, thanks. Indrajit, any other?
Yes, so there were a couple of questions also on the whole SME space, which I think is useful to focus on given the impact that it has from an employment standpoint. And the slowdown there is for all to see. So I think Jaideep Sarkar from Highcare wanted to know, given the kind of credit squeeze that we're seeing from banks and they're not lending forward, how are SMEs likely to survive this? And I think there was a similar question from Akash, and he asked about the point that Tarun was making about China, saying that, look, can we take a leaf out of what Alibaba did in terms of digitizing SMEs in China and ensuring that they could, be part of the transformative change that we saw in China as well? So what's the answer there? How should SMEs deal with this kind of slowdown where there is no working capital funding available, we're stuck in a logjam, and there is no effort to try and kind of bring them into, kind of a situation, out of this situation as well, where you don't have an Alibaba-like, entity, for instance, which can pull them out and provide new sources of revenue and business.
Let me add something here, and then I'm going to give it to both Rama and Sumit. Talking of SMEs, and Sumit pointed out that the things don't work on the ground for SMEs. And my experience, and I spent my years in the Planning Commission, and since then, looking into what really affects people on the ground, informal enterprises and SMEs. And I found this big disconnect that what really bothers them in terms of policy and bothers them in terms of implementation are not what the government is working on when it says ease of doing business, for example, which is a big flagship program. For example, going on saying that you've got to change the labor laws to enable firing of employees to be easier. And it's such a disconnect with the realities of these SMEs on the ground. That's not their problem. Their problem, as you said, is to do with the getting finance on time, the problem of getting space to operate in, harassment from inspectors perhaps, etc. Do we really listen to the real people about their real problems when we shape our policies? And the reason I mentioned Rama was that corporations have difficulties in operating in this country, big difficulties, tax laws and all the rest of it too. But they seem to be listened to much more when we talk about what are the policy solutions for the economy. But I know you do go out and look at the real people. What is your view on, are we listening well enough to the real problems of real people and not listening only to the rich?
I think we have a very selective view, even if I can use the analogy of the data issue that we're talking about. On the one hand, we say no data, no data, no data. On the other hand, I think the data points are fairly clear to us. Nobody has a permanent job. If you look at inclusion indicators, which include certain quality of living indicators and certain other things, we know that a very small proportion is actually included. We know that a quarter of urban India are qualified as slums, even by the census of India. We know growth is coming from census towns, which are neither fish nor fowl. So I think we're seeing a lot of this data, and I could go on and on. I mean, we've known for a while that we have been building this great consumer-led economy on shifting sand, because we also know that outside of the top 20% of people, or 25%, who we call the middle class, which in itself is a little bit intellectually dishonest, because we suggest there's a class above and a class below. So I think whereas actually you find that outside of them, nobody else really has any surplus income, and we're extremely vulnerable. Now the question is that why are we so selective in what we hear? Even when it comes to the SMEs, for example, we know credit is an issue. We all revile public sector banks, but I'm fairly clear that if it weren't for public sector banks, I haven't seen private sector banks very closely from the vantage points that I have, we wouldn't have had rural banking the way we've had it so far. And nobody wants to lend. I mean, corporate India does not want to really serve poor India or even middle India. They employ 6% of everybody. China serves actually the bulk of poor India. So as far as SMEs are concerned as well, a lot of the private banks are really, while they say SMEs, there is a segment of SMEs that have things on the ground. You have data, you have money trails, you are doing well enough, or you are attached to a large company. So all the SME ecosystems we're looking at are tied to big companies as vendors. So those are the kinds of people we like to serve. The question is that why don't we like to serve the rest? And I think we don't like to serve the rest because, you know, why kiss the frog when you can kiss the prince? And right now there is enough at the top level for companies to have. So are we listening? Do we care? If you look at public goods as well, which has been talked about, we've been seeing from NSS data over the years that a lot of everybody's consumption is conveyance, communication, healthcare, education. If you look at conveyance, healthcare, and education, these are public goods that the public should be providing. So I think if to your question, I don't know, are we listening well enough? I would actually add, so the government is not serving modest income and below. The corporate sector doesn't really want to. I mean, barring 2 or 3 or 4 companies, I cannot imagine any other company that really wants to go all the way down. When we say the rural markets are growing, basically half of India's rich live in rural areas, as do most of India's poor. So we're managing to tap the better heeled people in rural India as well. So I think my more fundamental question is that who is really interested in this lot? It's not market capitalism, and it's not, I mean, the government, in fact, has, while they probably haven't done well, as my colleagues have said, on a lot of issues. You know, I've seen the whole UPI, Jan Dhan rollout at fairly close quarters. And I think that there has been significant access because anything to do, or even if you look at the fact that you computerize the railways, what modest income people are really saying is that I get status client service and I have a better shot at it and I get access. It's the same story for LPG cylinders. It's the same story for a lot of other stuff. You're actually getting money directly into your bank accounts without having to beg the local dealer for a cylinder. So, I mean, there is some stuff happening and some stuff not happening. Do we listen carefully enough? Do we care? I think right now, because investment is the issue, the government has said, let's go and give tax breaks to big companies without realizing that they're not investing for a bunch of other reasons, which include being told to separate out chairman and managing director positions in promoter-run businesses, which defines most of India.
Thanks, Rama. I think this is a very good time for me to say, okay, let's look at where the whole ship is heading. Okay, and this is something Anurag has been bringing us to, that we have been sailing for a long time in a direction, and we are not sensing that that direction we had taken was going to be landing us in the problems that we now are sensing around ourselves. And this is not just an India problem, if I could say. This is probably a global issue. And this arises, to put it very simply then, quickly, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, actually, when we declared the end of history and said the ideologies of capitalism and democracy have won forever. And what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, we are sensing that the two victors of the Cold War, that is democracy and capitalism, are beginning to quarrel with each other. So we have Bernie Sanders in the United States talking against, like you did, Rama, in a way, about these big guys who really don't care for the small guys and they're more concerned about themselves. So there's a revival of what the Americans might call socialism, and might even be worse called communism, of a concern that the people generally are not benefiting by the course the ship has been taking, the economies have been taking in the last 20 or 30 years. So in this time, we in India must re-examine the ideologies that are driving us. And it's already been alluded to that we sort of think the government is the problem in everything and get the government out of the banks also. But as Rama, you said that the public sector banks are the ones that have cared much more for the people at the bottom, and maybe that's not enough. And so to get them out of the way, to leave it to the private banks who will make more money because they will not serve those segments of the market which they don't find profitable. Same story in healthcare and in education. Maybe it's not the right way to continue thinking as if we've been thinking that way for the last few years. So there is something deeper in terms of the shapes of institutions, and institutions are not merely the structures and positions and the buildings and the boards. The institutions are the ideas with which we shape the things that we do. And I'm wondering about what ideas we need, which are not capitalist ideas as presently we call capitalist, or democratic ideas in terms of just having elections, but deeper ideas about including people in the shaping of their own lives. And I might at this stage just introduce Mahatma Gandhi and his charka, because yes, Donald Trump did turn Mahatma Gandhi's charka at Sabarmati Ashram today. And there, Mahatma Gandhi and his economic advisors, Kumarappa and others, had thought of the economy very deeply by listening to things on the ground, observing things on the ground, and saying that unless people create wealth for themselves by producing with their own effort, with whatever little means they have, things that others want, and creating markets in which they are both producers and then become consumers, we will not grow our country bottom up and democratically. So that was the view. Whereas the prevalent view so much in terms of policies, let's ask the big people what they think our economy needs, and ask sort of foreign people to come in and tell us what's wrong with our economy. And so there's a big disconnect between the reality and what is required and what we are trying harder to do. So with that, I'm going to ask Anurag, you to come in again, since you have brought this up, and then Tarun, I'd like you to also comment after Anurag about sort of the bigger picture view in.
So Arun, since I've sort of, I seem to have adopted the role of the prophet of doom in this conversation, let me continue with that. Because in this whole conversation, we have not yet referred to something which is as big, as dramatic, as serious, maybe more serious than this, which is that India is going to be ground zero for climate change. Absolutely ground zero, right? So, I mean, if you want a nice line about it, you got an apartment in Bombay or Chennai, please sell it, okay? 30 years down the line, it's going to be underwater. Okay. So, and it's not just the geological, the physical aspect of it, but we know that the effects of climate change are disproportionately felt by the disadvantaged, by the poor. So, and I think we are just not conscious of this. And it's here, it's now onto us, right? So we do need to factor that matter in, right? Now, having sort of introduced one more.
Yes.
So
yes.
Let me go on.
Yes.
So Arun, I couldn't agree with you more, which is we have to be willing to discuss and debate and rethink at that fundamental level. Yes, democracy and capitalism are somehow in conflict, but let's say the unconscious and partly conscious drift towards market society in all its aspect, right? Marketization. And India perhaps taking the worst of both worlds. On one side, the let's call it the market economies, on the other side, let's call them the socialist economies, and not trying to, not being able to come out of the worst of both worlds. I think that's a very serious problem. The Indian elite, and almost everybody here is a part of that. The Indian elite has sort of, over the past 25, 30 years, and of course there are voices of different sorts, but on the whole, abandoned everything to the idea that the market will solve everything for us, which it doesn't. Now, if you come, let me give you a specific example, right? I talked about education, I talked about health. Clearly, education and health are the prototypical wicked problems to solve, right? You got to look at the system. There are so many aspects of the system, and so on and so forth. But let me point out one specific thing, which is true for health, true for education, which is if you're to improve public systems, while you do very many things, we should consider what kind of investment are we making? And investment is capacity, investment is culture. What kind of investment are we making at the very front line of our education system and the health system? Because eventually, children are taught by teachers. People who are ill, sick, they're cared for by the frontline health workers, right? What is the investment that our country is making these people? And like I said, investment is not just capacity, it's also the culture that's there. And if you were to look at that, it is shocking. Education, which is my area, I think our teacher education, teacher preparation system, which is preparing teachers, and I don't know how many of you would be familiar with that, I think it's the most broken system that we have. You know, we've talked about the 2G scam, 3G scam, coal scam, stuff like that. Yeah. That's the teacher, that's the front line of education. Then what is going to happen to this most important of our subsystems in this country? So let me summarize. A, I completely agree with you that we've got to rethink at that fundamental level and think of our own responsibilities as to where have we taken this country unconsciously, perhaps. B, public systems are important, and illustratively, in public systems, we should really, really consider what kind of investment are we making on our front line.
Tarun, bringing you in again, firstly, you know, you talked about China, and you said that China, well, we know that it's done better on education, certainly, school and primary and even higher education now than we have. And even generally on public health, they've had a crisis recently, but they've done much better on public health than India has done. What are your observations about how China organizes to do and deliver these public goods as compared to us?
You know, I'm reminded, so first of all, I'm in robust agreement with the last 2-3 comments. Let me pick up on this thread, Arun, as best I can. Apropos this public goods investment and the idea that, you know, the market can't solve everything. I mean, that's sort of, you know, economics 101 or even before that. Of course, that's true. I'm reminded of a quote that I'm going to attribute to a colleague at Berkeley, Pranab Bardhan, maybe inaccurately, but I'm sure he'd be happy to take it, which goes something like this, that China is capitalist today because it was communist yesterday, or it was socialist yesterday. And what he meant by that is that the entire kind of proliferation of the market economy in China, which you have seen dramatically in the last 30 years, is because it is built on a foundation of basic education for almost everybody, right? I mean, you couldn't have the special economic zones and the manufacturing fillip that you saw in the coastal regions in the 80s and 90s without educated frontline workers. So we've completely missed that, you know, going back to Nehru's time and after, we didn't emphasize and didn't invest in primary education. And you can hear from Anurag's comments that concerns about teachers, for instance, remains and are the subject of almost criminal neglect in India. So I think, you know, investing in education public goods to me seems like, you know, the root of many of our long run problems. And I'm sort of tempted to parse the problem as saying, you know, what are we going to do in the next 15, 20 years? Because any investment in primary education now, or even secondary education, fruits of that will not be visible for a little while. And separately, how do we fix the public good system? And, you know, I don't have how do we fix this kind of answer, Arun. But I wanted to just echo a point that I think you made in one of your summaries 15, 20 minutes ago, which is that there's so much distrust between different bits and pieces, between different sort of, what's the word to use, silos of our society, whether it's between the government and the private sector, it's within, you know, between industry and the science establishment is another one that I'm very involved with now, so it's front of mind for me. And maybe part of what we all need to do in the so-called privileged classes is to point these out and to articulate a path that we encourage the rest of society to move along with us. I had one last comment to make on Rama's comment that why kiss the frog when you can kiss the prince? I mean, it's I'm just very puzzled by this accurate observation that nobody is serving the poor. I mean, all the ventures that I try to start in India are squarely targeted to the poor. And to me, it's a question of innovation and mindset. I mean, the reason that it's not profitable to target the poor is that somebody hasn't sat down and figured out a creative approach to do it within the enormous constraints that developing countries all over the world present, including India. So it's a question of innovation, and I don't know how to enable that. So I agree with the comment, but I just wanted to say that it was a question of mindset and taking the time to innovate. But the broader point on public good investment, I robustly agree. The public education system in my backyard in the suburb of Boston is fabulous, and it's free. It's completely free. So that's something that I really wish that we could begin to pay some. And then, sorry if I may, I'm rambling a little bit, but just indulge me for a second. The comment about we don't have Alibabas and Tencents and so on. I work very closely with these large firms in China, and I have to say that not so long ago they were not large firms. They were very tiny firms. They were startups in effect, and went through near bankruptcy. In Tencent's case, for instance, this is the creator of WeChat, and in case that's a more familiar term to those on this broadcast. But the key is that they've displayed that innovative mindset from an early day, and I think that again goes back to being educated in a particular way and being cognizant of the possibilities, and not spending all our time wringing our hands in despair. So let me stop with that.
Yeah, thanks. So we have sort of missed the boat for a while in India, that we haven't invested sufficiently in public goods, education, and health. And on top of that, as Anurag pointed out, now this big thing which everyone in the world, and we, especially in India, must pay attention to, climate change, is also upon us. So we're going to have to work on many things at the same time. It's not a question of just working on education or on health or on infrastructure or on climate change. All this must happen together in the next few years, next 2 or 3 decades at the most. So how do you work on many things at the same time? And we talked about working in silos, and that's a problem here, and it's a problem elsewhere too, but much more here. These problems that I'm mentioning just now, of health and education and the quality of local infrastructure and livelihoods on the ground, and the climate and environment, they all come together in every place differently. These forces manifest themselves together in different shapes differently. So the solutions for all these simultaneously, and we have to find simultaneous solutions to them, will have to be local solutions. They will have to be found locally and with the cooperation of people locally applied. Otherwise, we will not lift ourselves up on all these cylinders, fire on all the cylinders that we need to soon. So this is a mindset shift also, that for these global systemic problems which are bothering us, let's find the solution for water all over the world, or the environment all over the carbon in the atmosphere all over the world, etc., and etc. Those solutions can't be applied locally. They'll again come down in silos, the 16 silos of the SDGs, and then they must work on the ground. So our solution has to be local system solutions, collaboratively implemented locally to these global systemic problems. Now, this is a mindset shift about the theory of change. It's a mindset shift in the theory of change. And I think we should get there pretty quickly. And examples of this working are in our own country, actually, and in other countries too. And people have written about it, and that's the way to change complex systems. But we go back to the old way of changing complex systems. There's so many problems that have experts in each of the problems, let them, each of them, give the solutions to each of their problems, and have projects in each of their problems, and somehow it'll all come together. It doesn't. It just makes a further mess. So, Sumit, I said I would come back to you, and you're working on systems. And I wonder, but I'm asking you, and I know your wife does great work on this too, and she uses the word Gaia also, which is about the whole earth. Sustains us, and the earth is a big system, and we are a small part of that big system. System thinking and collaborative working locally, people working together. How can we make this happen?
I think when I have been looking at this problem and seeing it, it's about, you know, the funding that was being given to be distributed to startups, for example. Each community is treated as a startup. And I'll give an example of what has happened in Spain in the smart city space. They gave 100,000 euros to every community, every neighborhood to come and solve a problem or a set of problems in their neighborhood. And the government said, you know what, we will seed fund you with $100,000. And 52 of these communities got funded only in Barcelona. And if you take a look at what Barcelona is today, and people talk about a large smart city project, it isn't one project, it is actually 52 communities doing their own thing, solving their own problem. And it's the fractal way of looking at life, that each fraction actually represents the whole. And they have similarities of how they go about solving it, but they could be different problems that they're solving. And if you take a look at gamification of this thing, which is what has happened over the last probably 6-7 years, we have tried, the government has also tried quite actively to gamify everything, top 10 cities, and let the top 20 cities be announced, and let this community do something. And they are constantly gauging each other through some parametric measures. If I take a look at this gamification theory, and as well as take it down to this whole concept of creating, I won't call them startups, but startup-like ideas in each community, funding these and seeing the efficacy of it, creating the measurement system such that they don't get squandered away. Unlike the MLA funds or the MP funds, which by and large go into pork barrel projects, each community. And again, it is decided by the MP and MLA, not by the community, by and large. And I think there's a new way of looking at there, and that could be one approach that we take to fund these communities with the money that is still available with them, by the way.
I can't help now adding, I mentioned Gandhiji earlier, and I've been reading a lot now, both of economics written by people outside and in our country, and the economics of Gandhiji and the people around him. And they're serious economists with a lot of experiments and randomized controlled trials and everything. Yeah. And they came to this solution that it has to be local system solutions. The agency has to be local, like you're saying. Yeah. It's the local people, they own it. And your job is to help them to solve their problems and not to go solve their problems for them. So we have in India, we've said so in our constitution, that it would be, village and ground up and inclusive. Then we found we weren't doing it well. We were still doing it top down a la Nehru, as we said, and coming down from there. And then we said the 73rd and 74th Amendment, which are already about 30 years ago. Oh, we've got to very deliberately create local managements in the cities and stakeholder-led, supported local managements in the cities as well as in our villages. But we don't do it. We still keep looking for big top-down sharp solutions. And I hate to say, quite often we're just looking outside India for these solutions and not realizing that the solutions will have to be innovations in India by the people, for the people, of the people. So who wants to come in for a moment and say, why is it that we are stuck in an old way of thinking?
So the structures exist, Arun. I think the funding doesn't exist. The local area committees are there. These people get together, they come up with ideas, but they are not adequately funded and supported in the process. I think that is where we can make a shift. Put a mechanism. If we are trying to find a solution, put a mechanism for these things to be adequately funded, not underfunded. Allow them to raise funds in the market. In fact, what these cities did in Europe is allow this community to take the 100,000 that they got, and they get corporates to fund another 100,000 or $1 million to build parks, to build, to improve the facade of the neighborhood, to put schools in there or playgrounds or whatever they were doing. but they were adequately funded and they were allowed to raise public funds along with it.
But I
we
think
just don't do it.
No, Sumita, we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. As you've been saying, it's the capacity of people locally to govern themselves more effectively. If they do that, they'll be able to demand the right sort of monies from the people above. They will also be then governing themselves well. They'll be able to attract investment. So the key first is local self-governance, well done. Now, our urban development schemes, and you were more recently connected with them, but I recollected when I was for 5 years looking after urban development in the Planning Commission, that every scheme under Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Rural Mission said 2% of the funds will be spent on building the capacities of local institutions. They were never spent. We all concentrated on the 98% to build the big visible infrastructure. We don't pay attention to building capacities, and they don't cost money. My point is they don't cost money to build the capacities of people to govern themselves, to help them build the capacity to govern themselves. It doesn't take money. It requires a certain skill. And you pointed out about consultants. What sort of consultants would one need to help local communities build their capacities?
So I was part of a consulting team that helped the Swachh Bharat mission. For 2 years, I was sitting with the program management unit of Swachh Bharat mission. And the entire capacity building fund actually got eaten up by the consultants themselves. So the community didn't get built. So it was the consultants' education system. And therefore, and nothing against them, but it needed to have been deployed to build the capacity of the people on the ground. We did build online courses though. So I will take that as one positive step we did, is to build online courses such that the local city authorities could get trained on that. So other than that, each city got to spend their capacity building the wrong way.
Right. Thank you.
Arun, can I?
Yes, Arun, please. Yes.
Again, going back to the, at least the intent, if we're looking for somewhere, maybe a bit desperately for the beginnings of green shoots, again, going back to the intent of the government, right? I mean, you have Swachh Bharat, and maybe it was bedeviled by the processes that we were just speaking about, or one that I was involved with in its creation was this Atal Innovation Mission, which again, the spirit is very much what you're saying, Arun and Sumit, right? Which is to have local innovation hubs in different places, or to have, or even to change the way in which science is taught in schools. But the emphasis very much is on local experimentation. The key again is just to continue to hammer away on the processes and the governance protocols to make sure that the intent is realized, and that these efforts are not swallowed up by the larger bureaucracy, even inadvertently. So I think the intent is there, and I don't think it's, I don't think we should be prophets of doom, as it were. I'd rather just roll up my sleeves and get a bunch of like-minded people and start pushing at wherever there is the possibility of the beginnings of change. Anyway, let me stop.
Well, thank you. And before I ask Indrajit to come in, yes, I want to confirm what you said, Tarun. Green shoots. India is full of these green shoots of people facilitating communities to form themselves, to take charge of themselves, innovation in that light. And so rather than looking for how many unicorns India is producing as an indicator of how well the economy is doing, looking at how many local communities are taking charge of their water management, of their agricultural practices, women farmers, and so on. And local school systems supported by, the government locally as well as the community, and so on. It's remarkable. I find that when innovation awards are given in terms of social innovations internationally, India gets half of them. But we don't notice that. We are still worrying about, the big investments and the big factories and the unicorns out of India. We could learn from ourselves too. And if we want to learn from ourselves, let's focus on what we want to learn from and what we want to learn about. Let me get off my little high horse now and ask Indrajit.
I think there's a question from Nandan Kolar. I think he talks about the fact that the panel's kind of listed out a lot of issues that are playing out on the ground, but startups do need to survive first and then hopefully next grow. So if one were to take and build a roadmap for the next maybe 18 months and slightly longer over the next 5 years, what are the sort of things that they ought to look at in terms of directionally, where should they move? I think there were some questions about the fintech startups that I think maybe someone like Rama could also take a stab at, because they've been bedeviled by a whole bunch of policy prescriptions that they're not able to kind of deal with, maybe. This is something that I thought be useful to for the panel to just provide some perspective in terms of what is it that they can tangibly do next.
Right, all right. So, okay, it's about now startups, and I guess this person, I forgot his name, excuse me. This question was really about people who are starting up in terms of a business, and the intention of the business is to produce some profit. So that sort of startup.
Yes.
Because there are other startups who I said are like more social ventures,
sure,
and they have a different experience. So these startups, Tarun and Rama would be the best qualified, I think.
Sure, sure.
To his question on this whole, fintechs and what should startups do, I mean, that is the nature of the beast, right? You have slowdowns and you don't. So I think if you focus on value and not valuation, I think we've got a good beginning there. And I think we don't realize that things take as long as they take. So for example, this whole fintech revolution and I'm seeing a lot of the chats that say we serve a lot of SMEs, we serve a lot of small companies. I think we're still talking creamy layer. We're still talking people who are suppliers to Amazon or suppliers somewhere where you get an entire ecosystem. And you say, well, I serve them in 10 seconds, 5 seconds, I have an algorithm, these are my NPAs, and so on and so forth. So I think that we have cracked the code, I honestly do, with the startup ecosystem that we have, because I think that it has used the power of digital to be able to serve people which big business couldn't, which is a lot of people who earn a little bit each that adds up to a lot. So I think we've cracked that, and I think we just have to wait for that to scale. So what should we do? I think one, the government of India is not the marketing director of any fintech or any big company or the auto sector or anybody else. So I think you just have to hang in there and do what you do and not get too adventurous along the way. I completely also agree with the comments that were made earlier that said that it is about, to use Arun's phrase, a million fireflies. It's not about a single edifice. So I think that the more startups that we have who are addressing very clearly defined markets as compared to wanting to become the next unicorn, I think we are in pretty good shape. So what should startups do? Have a little humility. Realize that fintechs, for example, are the arm. You may be the perfect arm, but you need the body. If the body is reeling with NPAs, you have to kind of wait for the money to come back into the system.
Tarun?
So I echo what Rama says, but I would add that my experience anyway has been that the ecosystem is, of course, working in some select geographies very well. Bangalore, of course, and Gurgaon and a couple other places, but not more broadly. And I also think it's not working for several other sectors. I mean, if you think about ag tech or even medical devices and things of that nature, where I think the degree of innovation that's required is perhaps more considerable. Perhaps it takes longer. We don't have the patience and we don't have yet enough experience in I know there are a lot of angel investors even amongst this panel. So at the risk of being rude, I'd say even amongst the angel investment community, we don't have enough experience with funding these kinds of things. Yes, in some segments, the digital economy, etc., and mobile telephony and IT services and so on, we've got plenty of experience. But outside that, I think it's still work in progress. But we have, as Rama says, we have the script. So we just have to execute on this and on the margin, think about how we could spread it to other places. I have a rule of thumb, Arun, when I'm involved with either as a co-founder or investor with a venture in Cambridge in Massachusetts, I usually give myself, assuming it survives, which it more often than not does not, since you're trying risky things. Assuming it survives, my rule of thumb is 5 years to exit. right? That's a reasonable rule of thumb. In India, it's more like 8, 9, 10 years. And that's how I plan for myself. So I think it's an indication of the relative difficulty of pulling it off. So,
so thanks for that. Indrajit, is there any other
There's
question?
One more question which is worth perhaps discussing, which is from Vivek Kelkar, and he asks the whole question of investments in public goods. Is it just a question of money? Perhaps not. Is it also a question of managing last mile systems and the bureaucratic ecosystem wherein, it's essentially talking about rent-seeking behavior, and how do you eliminate that? Because I think Sumit talked about the smart city projects getting hijacked by greedy consultants. Who is accountable, and how do you kind of cut out that from our system, as it were?
Anurag, would you like to look at it from the last mile angle? What happened to Anurag? We lost him.
Anurag is on mute, I think.
No, here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
How to get the system to work on the ground?
I think that's an accurate observation, that it's not just money. It is about making the system work at the last mile level, in the school, in the PHC, in all these places. That's absolutely true. But too often, by saying this, we ignore the money. So let's not forget the money. Without much more significant investment, what we need to do will not happen. Now, having said that, let me move on to what perhaps needs to be done on the ground at the last mile. And Arun, in some senses, it speaks to what you were saying about 15 minutes earlier. The thing that I have seen work on the ground is that governance, which suffuses everything, which at the ground level is really about, in the villages, is really about the panchayats, the local democracy institutions. So if you can revive the local democracy institution on one hand, that means governance is improving, and therefore their ability to demand, their ability to mobilize is improving of the local community. That's on one side. And that's insufficient. And on the other side, if there's investment in expertise, and to illustrate that, if there's investment in the right teacher, is there investment in making sure that the right kind of capacity is available at the public health center, right? Now, when both these things come together, then things start happening. So I think we've got to go back and pay attention to some of the governance architecture that we've envisioned, which in its architectural form is laudable, but it's not working. And again, it's an on-the-ground issue. So revive the local democracy institutions and then provide expertise which can actually serve the needs that are there.
Thank you, Anurag. Indrajit, I'm sensing that few very profound things have been said in the last hour. I've got some of my notes. I think it may not be possible for me, and I won't even attempt it, to try and sort of summarize and even select a few things that I would say at the end. I would much rather let people take what they've got out of this. I'm talking about the people who've been listening in, as also our panelists. And if Indrajit, you would, as you offered to do, very quickly in the next 48 hours probably, put together a capture of what has emerged. And as you said, some mind maps also of the clusters of thoughts and questions. And so, and feed that back to all of us. And you said that there will be an ongoing conversation on Slack. I think that would be very good. And I'd like to listen into it and contribute to it as it goes on. And I do hope that the other panelists would also find it interesting and useful to participate in this ongoing conversation on this subject about navigating the great Indian slowdown, and what we, as some of us as individual entrepreneurs and others as people who make policy or influence policy, can do about getting us all into a better place. So with that, Indrajit, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Myra, and Rama, Tarun, Anurag, and Sumit. I don't think we could have hoped for a better conversation, because it was in-depth, it was substantive, and left us with a lot of food for thought. And like Mr. Myra said, I think we'll need some time to process what has emerged, and that's something that we're hoping to do in the learning community that we formed on Slack. And there's be some stimulus, and we've requested people we've given them 3 questions to really process at the end of this session and take it up from tomorrow onwards. So I'd just kind of like to again thank the panel today and thank the audience that has joined us today. And we hope to continue this conversation. I have just one last announcement. We do have our next masterclass kind of planned in March. We're just still working out the dates. The theme is really around the future of platforms. You'd see Sangeet Paul Chaudhary joining us. He's likely to be in India in March. He's a global thought leader, a C-suite advisor, probably one of the best minds on the whole concept of platforms, which are kind of taking over the world of business. So this was a session that was planned earlier. Unfortunately, Sangeet was unwell, so he couldn't join. So we decided to bring him back. And I'm looking forward to kind of all of you coming and joining that session as well. But on behalf of, I think, Founding Fuel, thank you once again. And thank you for coming.